The lone figure stumbled through the arid wasteland as the merciless sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the New Mexico territory. Bethany Davis had been walking for what felt like days, her cracked lips bleeding, her once fine traveling dress now tattered and caked with the red dust of the desert. Betrayal burned hotter than the scorching heat that had blistered her fair skin. The memory of Edward's cold eyes, as he'd left her behind when the stagecoach continued on without her, still haunted her thoughts. The year was 1871, and Bethany had discovered too late that the man she'd traveled west to marry had no intention of following through with his promises. After a heated argument at their last stop, he'd conspired with the driver to leave while she freshened up at the small way station. By the time she'd realized what had happened, the coach was merely a dust cloud on the horizon, and the station keeper had shrugged unsympathetically. "Next coach ain't due for 2 weeks, miss." Unwilling to wait, convinced she could reach the next town before nightfall, Bethany had set out on foot. That had been yesterday morning, and now as dusk approached on the second day, her water gone and her strength failing, she realized the fatal error of her judgment. The sun dipped below the distant mountains, and the desert heat rapidly gave way to bone-chilling cold. Bethany's teeth began to chatter as she wrapped her arms around herself, her thin shawl offering little protection against the night air. Her legs finally gave out, and she collapsed onto the hard ground, tears streaming down her dust-streaked face. "So this is how it ends," she whispered to the darkening sky, watching as the first stars appeared. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd left Boston to escape a life of predictable security, only to die alone in the wilderness. As consciousness began to slip away, Bethany thought she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Probably just another hallucination, like the lakes of shimmering water she'd been seeing all day. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the cold that now seemed almost comforting in its numbing embrace. The hoofbeats grew louder, but Bethany no longer had the strength to open her eyes. A horse snorted nearby, followed by the crunch of boots on the rocky ground. "Hello, miss." A deep voice cut through her haze. "Good Lord, what are you doing out here?" Rough hands turned her over, and Bethany managed to part her eyelids just enough to see a man's silhouette against the darkening sky, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Can you hear me?" The man's voice was tinged with concern. "You're half frozen. Hang on." Bethany tried to respond, but her parched throat produced only a raspy sound before darkness claimed her completely. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Warmth against her right side, the crackling of a fire, the smell of coffee and something savory, the gentle pressure of a damp cloth against her forehead. Bethany's eyes fluttered open to find herself wrapped in several heavy blankets beside a small campfire. The night sky stretched above, a dazzling canopy of stars unlike anything she'd ever seen in Boston. "You're awake." The same deep voice from earlier came from across the fire. Bethany turned her head to see a man watching her carefully. The firelight illuminated his features, strong jaw covered in stubble, piercing eyes that seemed to reflect the flames, weather-beaten skin that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. He wasn't handsome in a conventional sense, but there was something compelling about his rugged appearance. Where her voice cracked, and immediately he was beside her, gently lifting her head and bringing a canteen to her lips. "Small sips," he instructed. "You're badly dehydrated." The water was the sweetest thing Bethany had ever tasted. After several careful sips, she found her voice again. "Thank you, I thought I was going to die out there." "You nearly did," he replied matter-of-factly. "Another hour and I wouldn't have found you until morning by then." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. "My name is Bethany Davis," she offered, attempting to sit up. Strong hands gently eased her back down. "Best stay still for now, Miss Davis. I'm Caleb Stone. Most folks just call me Stone." He moved back to his side of the fire. "Mind telling me what a lady like yourself was doing wandering the desert alone?" Bethany closed her eyes briefly, the humiliation of her situation washing over her anew. "I was abandoned, left behind at Larson's station while I was freshening up." Her voice grew stronger with indignation. "The man I traveled west to marry apparently decided I wasn't worth the trouble after all." Caleb's expression darkened. "That's more than 20 miles back. You've been walking all this time." "Yes. I thought I could reach Carson's Creek before nightfall yesterday." She gave a bitter laugh. "Clearly, I misjudged the distance." "Carson's Creek is another 30 miles west," Caleb said, shaking his head. "What's the name of this man who left you to die?" "Edward Holloway," Bethany replied, surprised by the venom in her own voice. "He's supposedly a successful banker in Silver Springs." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "I know of him. Never met the man, but his reputation precedes him." He poured a cup of coffee and added a generous spoonful of sugar before bringing it to her. "Think you can sit up for this? It'll help warm you from the inside." With his assistance, Bethany managed to sit upright, the blankets pooled around her waist. She accepted the tin cup, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. "What will happen to me now?" she asked after taking a sip of the strong, sweet coffee. "Well, Miss Davis, I'll take you to Carson's Creek tomorrow. There's a decent hotel there and a stagecoach stop. You can either continue on to Silver Springs if you're still of a mind to confront this Holloway fellow, or you can arrange passage back east." The thought of returning to Boston in disgrace made Bethany's stomach clench. "I have nowhere to go back east," she admitted. "I sold everything to come out here." Caleb regarded her thoughtfully across the fire. "The West isn't kind to those who come unprepared, but it rewards those with grit." He stirred the contents of a small pot hanging over the fire. "Are you hungry? It's just beans and bacon, but it's hot." "Starving," Bethany admitted. As Caleb served her a plate of the simple fare, Bethany took the opportunity to study him more carefully. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and strong hands. His clothing was practical worn leather chaps over denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal sinewy forearms, and a brown leather vest. A revolver hung at his hip, and a rifle rested within arm's reach. "Are you a lawman, Mr. Stone?" she asked between bites. He chuckled, the sound surprisingly warm. "No, madam, just a rancher heading back from selling some horses in Santa Fe, and please call me Caleb. Out here formalities don't mean much." "Then you must call me Bethany," she replied. As they ate, Bethany shared more of her story, how she'd been working as a teacher in Boston when Edward's advertisement for a bride had caught her eye. Their correspondence had been promising, his letters painting a picture of a respectable life in a growing town. What she didn't mention was how desperate she'd been to escape the suffocating expectations of her parents, who had been pushing her toward a loveless marriage with a much older family friend. "What about you?" she asked, setting aside her empty plate. "Do you have family waiting for you at your ranch?" A shadow passed over Caleb's face. "No, just hired hands. My wife died of fever 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Bethany said, genuine sympathy in her voice. Caleb nodded his acknowledgement. "My ranch is about 15 miles north of Carson's Creek. It's not much compared to the big cattle operations, but it's mine. Paid for it with blood and sweat." He glanced at her. "You should get some rest. We'll head out at first light." Despite her exhaustion, Bethany found sleep elusive. The desert night was alive with unfamiliar sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of wind through scrub brush, the occasional snort from Caleb's horse tethered nearby. Across the fire, Caleb sat with his back against his saddle, hat tipped down over his eyes, but she sensed he wasn't sleeping either. "Caleb," she ventured softly, "thank you for saving my life." He lifted his hat slightly to look at her. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Bethany said firmly. "Not anyone. Edward wouldn't have." In the flickering firelight, she saw a small smile curve his lips. "Then I reckon you're better off without Edward Holloway, Bethany Davis." With that comforting thought, she finally drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. Dawn broke with startling swiftness, the eastern sky painted in vivid strokes of pink and gold. Bethany awoke to find Caleb already up, the coffee pot bubbling over a freshly built fire. Her body ached from her ordeal, but the night's rest had restored much of her strength. "Morning," Caleb greeted, handing her a steaming cup. "How are you feeling?" "Sore, but alive thanks to you," she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "We should reach Carson's Creek by midday if we make good time." He hesitated. "Can you ride?" "My horse can carry double, but it'll be faster if you can handle him while I walk alongside." Bethany had ridden in Boston's parks occasionally, but never Western style. "I can try," she said, unwilling to be a greater burden than she already was. After a breakfast of hardtack and jerky, Caleb helped Bethany onto his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes. "This is Buck," he said, adjusting the stirrups for her shorter legs. "He's steady as they come." The saddle was nothing like the side saddles Bethany was accustomed to, and she felt immodest with her skirts hiked up to accommodate the proper riding position. Caleb, however, maintained a respectful demeanor, his eyes never lingering inappropriately. As they set out, the rising sun began to transform the landscape. What had seemed desolate and forbidding in the heat of yesterday now revealed subtle beauty, the delicate colors of desert flowers opening to the morning light, the dramatic shadows cast by rock formations, the vast openness that spoke of possibility rather than emptiness. "It's beautiful in its own way, isn't it?" Bethany mused aloud. Caleb, walking beside the horse with an easy stride, glanced up at her with mild surprise. Most Easterners never see past the harshness. "Perhaps near-death experiences make one more appreciative," she replied with a small smile. That earned a chuckle from Caleb. Perhaps so. As they traveled, Bethany found herself watching Caleb more than the scenery. There was an ease to his movements, a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was capable of. It was so different from the posturing of Boston men, with their affected mannerisms and carefully cultivated appearances. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, genuinely curious. "Stone Ranch isn't grand," he began, a note of pride entering his voice despite his modest words. 200 acres, mostly for horses. I breed and train cow ponies for the cattle outfits. Got about 30 head now, including some promising young stock. Small cabin, barn, corral. 2 hired hands brothers named Martinez who have been with me since the beginning." "You raise horses rather than cattle?" Bethany asked, remembering the little she knew about Western ranching. "Cattle take more land, more water, more hands," Caleb explained. "Horses suited me better. Always had a way with them, even as a boy." "Were you born out west?" Caleb shook his head. "Missouri originally. Came west after the war." "You fought in the war between the states?" Bethany asked, noting how his shoulders tensed slightly at the question. "Union cavalry," he confirmed briefly, in a tone that discouraged further inquiry on that topic. They continued in companionable silence for a while, Bethany adjusting to the rhythm of the horse beneath her, Caleb maintaining a steady pace beside them. The sun climbed higher, and the day grew warmer, though nowhere near as brutally hot as the previous day had been. Around mid-morning, they stopped in the shade of a large rock formation to rest and water the horse. Caleb helped Bethany dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment after her feet touched the ground, he didn't immediately release her, and their eyes met in a brief exchange that sent an unexpected flutter through Bethany's chest. Caleb cleared his throat and stepped back. "We should reach town in a couple hours." The thought of arriving in Carson's Creek filled Bethany with unexpected apprehension. What would she do there? Her plans had centered entirely around reaching Silver Springs and Edward Holloway, but now the thought of pursuing that course seemed foolish. Yet the alternative, being stranded in a strange town with limited funds and no prospects, was equally daunting. "What's troubling you?" Caleb asked, observing her pensive expression as she sipped water from his canteen. "I'm wondering what awaits me in Carson's Creek," she admitted. "I hadn't planned beyond reaching Silver Springs." "Carson's Creek is a decent town," Caleb said. "Small but growing. Has a school that might need a teacher." Bethany looked up in surprise. "How did you know I was a teacher?" A faint smile touched his lips. "You mentioned it last night. Said you were teaching in Boston before answering Holloway's advertisement." "I didn't realize you were listening so carefully," she said, oddly touched that he'd retained that detail. "I pay attention," he replied simply. After a brief pause, he added, "If the school doesn't need anyone, the widow Parker runs a respectable boarding house. She might hire help. Would give you time to figure out your next steps." The fact that he was thinking about her future stirred something warm inside Bethany. "Thank you for the suggestions. I suppose I'll have to see what opportunities present themselves." As they prepared to continue their journey, Bethany found herself reluctant to reach their destination. Despite the circumstances of their meeting, she felt comfortable in Caleb's presence in a way she couldn't quite explain. Back on the trail, the landscape gradually began to show signs of human activity. A rutted wagon road replaced the faint trail they'd been following, and occasionally they passed fenced sections of land with cattle or horses grazing in the distance. "That's part of the Carson spread," Caleb said, gesturing toward a herd of cattle visible on a nearby hillside. "Old Man Carson owns most of the land around the creek. Town's named after him, naturally." "Is he a fair man?" Bethany asked, thinking she might need to seek employment with prominent citizens. "Fair enough," Caleb replied. "Hard businessman, but he doesn't cheat. His son Brett runs most of the operation now. Bit of a hothead, that one, but smart when it comes to cattle." As they crested a small rise, Carson's Creek came into view in the valley below a collection of wooden buildings straddling both sides of a narrow watercourse, with a church steeple rising above the other structures, and several roads radiating outward like spokes from a wheel. "There it is," Caleb said, stopping to let Bethany take in the sight. "Not San Francisco, but it serves its purpose." Bethany studied the town, trying to imagine herself making a life there. It was larger than she'd expected, with perhaps 40 or 50 buildings visible from their vantage point. "It looks civilized," she said finally. Caleb laughed, a genuine sound that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Civilized enough to have a hotel with real beds and a bathhouse where you can wash off the desert dust. Beyond that, I make no promises." The mention of a proper bath made Bethany acutely aware of her bedraggled state. Her once fine blue traveling dress was torn and filthy, her hair a tangled mess, her face undoubtedly streaked with dirt, despite her attempts to clean up at their morning stop. "I must look a fright," she murmured, suddenly self-conscious about entering town looking so disheveled. "You look like a woman who survived the desert," Caleb said simply. "Nothing to be ashamed of in that." His matter-of-fact reassurance eased her embarrassment, and they continued down the slope toward town. As they approached the outskirts, they began to encounter other travelers, a farmer with a wagon loaded with produce, a pair of cowboys leading pack horses, a woman driving a buggy who nodded politely as they passed. Bethany noticed how people greeted Caleb with respect, not the deference shown to wealth or station that she was accustomed to in Boston, but the genuine acknowledgement given to a man who had earned his place in the community. They entered Carson's Creek proper, the unpaved main street lined with hitching posts, wooden sidewalks, and various businesses: a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and farther down, a two-story building with a sign identifying it as the Carson Creek Hotel. "We'll get you settled at the hotel first," Caleb said, leading the way. Bethany's stomach twisted with anxiety. "Caleb, I should tell you that my funds are limited. Edward was to provide for me upon arrival." Caleb's expression darkened momentarily at the mention of Edward, but he nodded. "The hotel's reasonable. A room for a few nights won't break the bank while you look for work." As they approached the hotel, several townsfolk openly stared at Bethany's disheveled appearance and the unusual sight of Caleb Stone leading his horse with a woman in his saddle. Bethany held her head high despite her embarrassment. The hotel was a well-maintained wooden structure with a wide porch and large windows. Caleb helped Bethany dismount, his hands lingering at her waist just long enough for her to regain her balance. The contact sent a ripple of awareness through her that she wasn't entirely prepared for. "Thank you," she said softly, meeting his eyes. "For everything." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight parting of his lips as if he wanted to say something more than the situation called for. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Let's get you checked in." The hotel lobby was modestly appointed but clean, with a polished wooden counter and a small sitting area with chairs and a table holding newspapers. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles, looked up as they entered, his eyebrows rising at Bethany's appearance. "Mr. Stone," he greeted, then cast a curious glance at Bethany. "Thomas," Caleb replied with a nod. "Miss Davis needs a room. Found her out in the desert yesterday. Stagecoach left her behind at Larson's station." The clerk's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Good Lord, you're fortunate, Mr. Stone found you, Miss. Larson's is a fair distance." "I'm very aware of that, Mr. Thomas," Bethany replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "How much for a room for a week?" Caleb asked, cutting through the clerk's awkwardness. "That would be $14, Mr. Stone." Before Bethany could open her reticule to count out her remaining funds, Caleb placed 3 gold coins on the counter. "That should cover the room, meals, and bath service." "Caleb, no," Bethany protested, but he silenced her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Consider it a loan," he said quietly. "You can repay me when you're settled." The clerk pushed a register toward Bethany. "If you'll just sign here, Miss Davis." As Bethany signed her name, she was acutely aware of Caleb standing beside her, his solid presence a comfort she hadn't realized she'd come to rely on in their short acquaintance. The thought of him leaving sent a pang of something very like loss through her chest. "Room 4, upstairs on the right," the clerk said, handing her a key. "I'll have hot water sent up for a bath right away." "Thank you," Bethany said, then turned to Caleb. Are you staying in town?" He shook his head. "Need to get back to the ranch. Been gone longer than planned as it is." Of course he had responsibilities, a life to return to. Bethany nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "I understand. I've delayed you enough already." "No delay," he said firmly. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten with emotion. "How can I ever repay you properly? Make a good life here," he said simply. "That'll be payment enough." They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodbye. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat. "I should see to Buck before I head out. I'll check in on you when I'm next in town, probably Saturday, for supplies." "Saturday," Bethany repeated, oddly comforted by the knowledge that she would see him again. "I'll look forward to it." Caleb hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. His palm was rough with calluses against her softer skin, but his touch was gentle. "Take care of yourself, Bethany Davis." "And you, Caleb Stone." With a final nod, he released her hand and turned to leave. Bethany watched through the hotel window as he untied his horse from the hitching post, swung into the saddle with easy grace, and rode back the way they had come. Only when he disappeared from sight did she realize she was clutching the room key so tightly that it had left an imprint on her palm. The bath that followed was blissful, a large copper tub filled with steaming water, scented with a simple lavender soap that felt like the height of luxury after her ordeal. Bethany scrubbed away the desert dust, washed her hair, and tried to restore some order to her appearance. The hotel maid had taken her filthy dress away to be laundered, leaving Bethany with no choice but to don the simple cotton wrapper she'd packed in her small traveling bag. After the bath, exhaustion overtook her, and she collapsed onto the bed. Though not luxurious, the clean sheets and soft mattress felt like heaven after sleeping on the hard ground. She fell asleep almost instantly, dreaming of campfires and the sound of a deep voice telling her she was better off without Edward Holloway. Bethany awoke to late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory flooded back the desert, Caleb's rescue, their arrival in Carson's Creek. She sat up, feeling refreshed despite the lingering soreness in her muscles. A knock at the door startled her. "Yes, dinner's being served downstairs, Miss Davis," a woman's voice called. "And I've brought your dress back. It's clean, though I couldn't do much about the tears." Bethany opened the door to find a middle-aged woman with a kind face holding her blue traveling dress, now clean but still showing the evidence of her desert ordeal. "Thank you," Bethany said, taking the garment. "I'm Mrs. Weber, the hotel manager," the woman said. "My husband Thomas checked you in earlier. He told me what happened to you. Terrible business being left behind like that." "Yes, it was," Bethany agreed, not eager to rehash the experience. Mrs. Weber seemed to sense her reluctance. "Well, you're safe now, and that's what matters. Mr. Stone is a good man. If he's looking out for you, you'll be all right." "He's just being kind," Bethany said quickly, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "We only met yesterday when he found me in the desert." Mrs. Weber's expression was knowing. "Caleb Stone doesn't go out of his way for just anyone, miss. Not since he lost his Sarah." She glanced down the hallway. "Come down when you're dressed. The dining room's just off the lobby. First meals included with your room, after Mrs. Weber left. Bethany dressed quickly, her mind turning over the woman's words. Who was Sarah? Caleb had mentioned losing his wife to fever, but hadn't shared her name. The thought that she might be the first woman he'd shown any particular concern for, since his wife's death, stirred complicated feelings in Bethany's chest. Downstairs, the small dining room held a half-dozen tables, only 2 of which were occupied, one by a traveling salesman type with catalogs spread before him, the other by an elderly couple who nodded politely as Bethany entered. She chose a table near the window, where she could watch the activity on the street outside. Carson's Creek was busier than she'd expected, with a steady flow of people and wagons passing by. Men in cowboy attire mingled with more formally dressed townspeople. Women in practical calico dresses carried shopping baskets, and children darted between the adults with the universal energy of youth. The meal was simple but hearty: roast beef, potatoes, and carrots, with apple pie for dessert. As Bethany ate, she considered her situation. She had enough money to survive perhaps 2 weeks if she was frugal, less if she remained at the hotel after the week Caleb had paid for. Finding employment quickly would be essential. After dinner, feeling restless, Bethany decided to explore the town while there was still daylight. She needed to get her bearings and perhaps inquire about employment opportunities. The clerk provided directions to the school, and Bethany set out with purpose in her step. Carson's Creek was laid out in a grid pattern, with the main street running east to west and several cross streets heading north and south. The businesses clustered in the center, with residences spreading outward. The school, Bethany discovered, was a modest single-room building at the eastern edge of town, currently closed for the day. As she turned back toward the center of town, Bethany noticed a small building with a sign reading Carson's Creek Gazette in the window. A newspaper might have information about available positions, she reasoned, and stepped inside. The office contained a large printing press, several desks covered with papers, and a counter where a young man was sorting type. He looked up as the bell above the door announced her entrance. "Can I help you, madam?" he asked, pushing his ink-stained hands into his pockets. "I hope so," Bethany replied. "I'm new in town and looking for employment. I wondered if you might know of any positions suitable for an educated woman." The young man studied her with interest. "What sort of work are you looking for, miss?" "Davis, Bethany Davis. I was a teacher in Boston, but I'm willing to consider other respectable employment." "Well, Miss Davis, you're in luck. Old Mr. Finch, who taught at our school, took ill last month and returned east to live with his daughter. The town council's been looking for a replacement." He extended his hand. "I'm Daniel Harper, by the way, reporter and sometimes typesetter for the Gazette." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Harper," Bethany said, shaking his hand. "Who should I speak with about the teaching position?" "That would be Mayor Wilson. His office is just down the street, though he's probably gone home for the day. You could catch him there tomorrow morning." Daniel hesitated, then added, "If you don't mind my asking, what brings you to Carson's Creek?" "We don't get many Easterners, especially unaccompanied ladies." Bethany considered how much to share. "It's rather a long story, but the short version is that I came west to marry, but the arrangement fell through." Daniel nodded sympathetically. "Well, Carson's Creek could use a proper teacher. The mayor will be glad to meet you." He glanced at a wall clock. "I'm about to close up, but I'd be happy to walk you back to wherever you're staying. Town's mostly decent, but it can get rowdy after dark." "Thank you, but that's not necessary. I'm at the hotel just down the street." As Bethany turned to leave, Daniel called after her, "Oh, Miss Davis, there's a social at the church Saturday evening. Might be a good way to meet folks if you're planning to stay." Saturday, the day Caleb had said he'd be in town. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. I'll consider it." Back at the hotel, Bethany settled in the small lobby with a book borrowed from the modest shelf provided for guests. Her mind, however, kept wandering from the page to thoughts of what lay ahead: the meeting with the mayor tomorrow, the possibility of securing the teaching position, and, unbidden but persistent, the memory of Caleb Stone's hands at her waist as he'd helped her from his horse. The next morning, Bethany dressed with care in her mended blue dress, the only one she had, until she could afford new clothing, and made her way to the mayor's office after breakfast. Mayor Wilson proved to be a portly, affable man in his 50s, who seemed delighted at the prospect of hiring a Boston-educated teacher. "Been trying to convince the council we need someone with proper credentials," he explained, gesturing for Bethany to take a seat. "Most of the young-uns here barely get beyond reading, writing, and ciphering before they're put to work on the ranches or in the shops. Education is essential for building a strong community," Bethany said earnestly. Even those who will work with their hands benefit from a broader understanding of the world. Mayor Wilson beamed. Exactly what I've been saying. Now, the position pays $40 a month, with a small cabin behind the schoolhouse provided as living quarters. Term starts in 2 weeks, which should give you time to prepare lessons and settle in. He leaned forward conspiratorially. Between us, you're the only applicant with actual teaching experience, so unless you sprout horns and a tail before the council meeting tonight, the position is yours. Relief washed over Bethany. $40 a month wasn't a fortune, but it would allow her to live independently. Thank you, Mayor Wilson. I'm eager to meet the council and discuss my qualifications further. 7 o'clock at the town hall, the mayor said, standing to shake her hand. Don't be nervous, they're all bark and no bite. With the prospect of employment nearly secured, Bethany spent the rest of the day exploring Carson's Creek more thoroughly. She visited the general store to inquire about prices for basic necessities, stopped by the school to peek through the windows at what would likely be her classroom, and even ventured into the small church that stood at the north end of town. The church was empty except for a middle-aged woman arranging flowers at the altar. She looked up as Bethany entered, offering a warm smile. "Good afternoon. Are you new to our congregation?" "New to town entirely," Bethany replied, returning the smile. "I'm Bethany Davis. I may be taking the teaching position at the school." "Oh, wonderful. I'm Martha Thompson, the minister's wife." She came forward to shake Bethany's hand. "We've been praying for a good teacher for our children. Where are you from originally, Miss Davis?" "Boston," Bethany said, finding herself drawn to Martha's genuine warmth. "It's quite a change coming west." "I imagine so. I grew up in Philadelphia myself, came out here 20 years ago when John took this posting." Martha gestured around the simple church. "It was even more primitive than the church was just a tent for the first year." "It must have been challenging," Bethany said, genuinely impressed. "The hardest and best thing I ever did," Martha replied. "Has anyone told you about our Saturday social? It would be a perfect opportunity for you to meet families from town and the surrounding ranches." "Yes, Mr. Harper at the newspaper mentioned it." "Excellent. It starts at 6. Nothing fancy, just food, conversation, maybe some music if anyone's in the mood to play." Martha tilted her head curiously. "Are you staying at the hotel? I heard Thomas mention a young woman who'd been rescued from the desert by Caleb Stone." News clearly traveled fast in Carson's Creek. "Yes, that's me. Mr. Stone found me after I was separated from my traveling party." Martha's expression grew serious. "You're fortunate he found you. The desert is unforgiving to the unprepared." She brightened again. "Caleb usually comes to the socials when he's in town for supplies. He's not one for crowds, but he knows everyone expects to see him at least once a month." The thought of seeing Caleb again in a social setting caused an unexpected flutter in Bethany's stomach. "He mentioned he'd be in town Saturday." "Perfect. Now you'll know at least 2 people at the social," Martha said cheerfully. "Speaking of which, I should finish these arrangements. The Ladies' Aid Society meets here this afternoon." As Bethany left the church, she found herself looking forward to Saturday with growing anticipation. The town council meeting that evening went exactly as Mayor Wilson had predicted after presenting her credentials and answering a few questions about her teaching philosophy. Bethany was officially offered the position. She would start in 2 weeks, with access to the teacher's cabin available immediately. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Bethany moved into the small cabin behind the schoolhouse, a modest but clean dwelling with a bedroom, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a tiny kitchen. The furniture was basic but functional: a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair beside the fireplace, and a small bookshelf containing various textbooks and readers. With her first month's salary advanced to her by the town council, Bethany purchased essentials from the general store: cooking utensils, linens, food staples, and fabric to make a new dress for the social. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Abernathy, proved to be a font of information about the town and its inhabitants, happily sharing gossip as she helped Bethany select her purchases. "So you're the woman Caleb Stone rescued," Mrs. Abernathy said, measuring out fabric. "That's caused quite a stir, let me tell you. Caleb keeps to himself mostly, has since his wife passed. Some thought he might marry the widow Johnson last year. She made it clear she was interested, but he never showed any inclination." "We barely know each other," Bethany protested, uncomfortable with the implication. "He simply helped someone in need." Mrs. Abernathy smiled knowingly. "Of course, dear. 3 yards of the blue calico, you said." By Saturday, Bethany had settled into a routine in her new home and finished sewing a simple but becoming dress of blue calico with white trim. As she dressed for the social, she found herself taking extra care with her appearance, arranging her chestnut hair in a more flattering style than her usual practical bun, adding a touch of rose water to her wrists and throat. "This is ridiculous," she murmured to her reflection in the small mirror hanging beside the door. "He's simply a kind man who helped you. Nothing more." Yet as she walked the short distance to the church as twilight fell, Bethany couldn't deny the anticipation that quickened her steps. The churchyard was already filled with people when she arrived, families with children running about, couples young and old, single men in their best shirts looking somewhat uncomfortable in the social setting. Martha Thompson spotted her immediately and hurried over. "Bethany, I'm so glad you came. Let me introduce you around." The next hour passed in a whirl of introductions. Bethany met so many people she doubted she would remember half their names, but everyone was welcoming. Many were parents of future students, eager to meet their children's new teacher and make a good impression. As darkness fell completely, lanterns were lit around the churchyard, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Tables laden with food had been set up, and a small group of musicians began playing near the church steps. Bethany found herself enjoying the simple celebration more than any formal Boston social event she'd ever attended. She was chatting with the blacksmith's wife when she felt a change in the atmosphere, a subtle shift in the crowd's energy. Glancing toward the churchyard entrance, she saw Caleb Stone stepping through the gate, looking somewhat out of place in the festive setting despite his cleaned-up appearance. He'd exchanged his trail-worn clothes for a fresh shirt and vest, and his dark hair was neatly combed, though still a bit too long by Eastern standards. Bethany's heart gave a ridiculous leap at the sight of him. He scanned the crowd, nodding to acquaintances, until his eyes found hers. The smile that spread across his face sent warmth flooding through her entire body. "Excuse me," she murmured to the blacksmith's wife, who followed Bethany's gaze and smiled knowingly. As Bethany made her way toward Caleb, several people stopped him to chat, and she could see him responding politely but briefly, clearly attempting to disengage. When she finally reached him, the relief on his face was almost comical. "Miss Davis," he said formally, though his eyes held a warmth that belied the formality. "I hear congratulations are in order, the new school teacher already making her mark on Carson's Creek." "Mr. Stone," she replied, matching his tone but unable to suppress her smile. "Thank you. It seems I have you to thank for more than just my rescue. Your recommendation apparently carries significant weight in this community." Caleb looked genuinely surprised. "My recommendation? Mrs. Weber mentioned that if you were looking out for me, I'd be all right." I assume word spread that you had vouched for my character." A slight flush colored his tanned cheeks. "I may have mentioned to the mayor that you seemed like a sensible woman who'd make a fine teacher, but that's hardly a formal recommendation. Nevertheless, I appreciate it." Bethany gestured toward the tables of food. "Have you eaten? Mrs. Thompson assured me the fried chicken is not to be missed." They filled plates and found a relatively quiet spot at the edge of the gathering. As they ate, Bethany told Caleb about her new position and the cabin behind the schoolhouse. "It's small, but it's mine," she said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "After living under my parents' roof and then boarding with a family in Boston while I taught, having my own home feels like a luxury." "Independence suits you," Caleb observed, watching her with those intent eyes that seemed to see more than she intended to reveal. "You've settled in quickly." "I'm adaptable," Bethany replied with a small shrug. "And everyone has been welcoming. It's quite different from Boston society, where it takes years to be accepted. Folk out here judge you on what you do, not who your family is or how long you've been around," Caleb said. "Do good work, treat people fairly, and you'll be considered one of their own soon enough." Their conversation flowed easily, moving from Bethany's new life in Carson's Creek to Caleb's ranch and the horses he was training. There was a comfort between them that belied their short acquaintance, as if they'd known each other far longer than the few days that had passed since he'd found her in the desert. As the evening progressed, the musicians struck up a livelier tune, and couples began to dance in the cleared area near the church steps. Bethany watched them with interest. The dancing was less formal than the structured waltzes and quadrilles she was accustomed to, with more emphasis on enjoyment than precision. "You dance, Mr. Stone?" she asked, noting how his foot was tapping slightly to the rhythm. "Not for a long time," he admitted, a shadow passing briefly over his features. "Though I used to enjoy it." On impulse, Bethany stood and held out her hand. "Then perhaps it's time to remember how." Caleb looked up at her in surprise, then at her outstretched hand. For a moment she thought he would refuse, but then he set aside his plate and rose to his full height, towering over her petite frame. "I'd be honored, Miss Davis," he said, taking her hand. As he led her to the dancing area, Bethany was acutely aware of the eyes following them. Caleb Stone dancing was apparently an unusual enough sight to draw attention. But once they joined the other couples, and Caleb's arm slipped around her waist, the rest of the gathering seemed to fade away. He moved with the same natural grace he showed on horseback, guiding her through the simple steps with a sure touch. Bethany, accustomed to more structured dances, followed his lead easily, enjoying the freedom of the country style. "You dance well for someone who claims to be out of practice," she teased as he turned her under his arm. "Some things you don't forget," he replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Their eyes met and held, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been building since he'd carried her half-frozen body to his campfire. Bethany felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze, but she didn't look away. The music ended too soon and they stepped apart, though Caleb's hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary. Before either could speak, Martha Thompson appeared at Bethany's elbow. "Caleb Stone dancing. Now I've seen everything," she said with good-natured teasing. "Bethany, you must have special powers." Caleb cleared his throat, looking uncharacteristically flustered. "Miss Davis is persuasive," he said simply. "Well, don't disappear yet," Martha continued. "The children are about to perform the song they've been practicing, and then we're serving pie." As Martha moved on to alert others, Bethany and Caleb found themselves standing close together at the edge of the crowd, watching as the town's children gathered near the musicians. "I should warn you," Caleb murmured close to her ear, sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. The Carsons Creek Children's Choir is an experience that tests even the most charitable listener. Bethany suppressed a laugh. I'll soon be responsible for improving their musical education, so I should pay close attention to the areas needing work. The children's performance was indeed enthusiastic rather than melodious, but Bethany applauded warmly when they finished, already making mental notes about incorporating music lessons into her curriculum. As the evening continued, Bethany and Caleb remained together, sharing pie and conversation, occasionally joined by others but always gravitating back to each other when left alone. The easy camaraderie they'd established on the journey to Carsons Creek deepened, enriched by the knowledge that they were no longer simply rescuer and rescued, but two people discovering a genuine connection. When the social began to wind down, families with young children departing first, followed by the older residents, Bethany realized with a start that the evening had passed more quickly than she'd expected. "I should walk you home," Caleb said as they watched the Thompsons bidding farewell to the last guests. "It's getting late." "I'd appreciate that," Bethany replied, though her cabin was hardly far enough to justify an escort. The thought of extending their time together was too appealing to refuse. They walked slowly through the quiet streets, the sounds of the social fading behind them. The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant overhead in a way Bethany had never seen in Boston. "Will you stay in town tonight?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "No, I need to get back to the ranch," Caleb replied. "The Martinez brothers are capable, but I don't like to be away too long, especially with the new foals." Disappointment tugged at her, though she knew his answer was sensible. "When will you be in town again?" "Probably in 2 weeks for supplies," he said, then added with a hint of hesitation, "though I could make it sooner if there was a reason." His words hung in the air between them, an invitation and a question. Bethany's heart quickened. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Perhaps you could tell me more about the families of the children I'll be teaching. It would help me prepare." It was a transparent excuse, but Caleb nodded as if it made perfect sense. "I could come next Saturday," he offered. "Bring you some of Mrs. Martinez's tamales. Best you'll ever taste." "I'll look forward to it," Bethany said as they reached her cabin. The small porch was illuminated by the lantern she'd left burning in the window, casting a warm glow over the simple wooden structure. They paused at the bottom of the porch steps, neither quite ready to say goodbye. Caleb removed his hat, holding it almost awkwardly in his hands. "Thank you for the dance," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "and the company." "Thank you for the rescue," Bethany replied with a small smile. "Not just from the desert, but from what would have been a very uncomfortable first social event where I knew almost no one." Caleb chuckled, relaxing slightly. "You'd have managed fine on your own. You seem to have charmed the entire town already." "Not the entire town," she corrected, gathering her courage. "There's at least one resident whose opinion I'm not entirely sure of." His expression softened, and he took a half-step closer. "If you're referring to me, Miss Davis, you should know that I find you." He paused, searching for the right word. "Remarkable." The simple compliment warmed her more than any flowery declaration ever could have. "I find you quite remarkable as well, Mr. Stone." For a moment, Bethany thought he might kiss her, and was surprised by how much she wanted him to. Instead, Caleb took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply affecting. "Good night, Bethany," he said, using her given name for the first time since their journey to town. "Good night, Caleb," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He waited until she was safely inside with the door closed before she heard his footsteps retreating. Bethany leaned against the door, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was racing. What was happening to her? She'd come west to marry a man she'd corresponded with for months, yet here she was, undeniably drawn to a man she'd known for barely a week. "This is madness," she whispered to the empty cabin, but the words lacked conviction even to her own ears. The days that followed were filled with preparation for the start of the school term. Bethany cleaned and organized the schoolhouse, reviewed the available textbooks, and began drafting lesson plans for students ranging in age from 6 to 16. The work was engaging and kept her busy, but her thoughts frequently strayed to Caleb and their upcoming Saturday meeting. By the time Saturday arrived, Bethany had cleaned her small cabin thoroughly, baked an apple pie with fruit purchased from the general store, and changed her dress 3 times before settling on the new blue calico. She was arranging wildflowers in a jar on her table when a knock at the door sent her heart racing. Caleb stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking freshly shaven and slightly nervous. A cloth-covered basket hung from one arm. "Right on time," Bethany said, stepping back to invite him in. "Please, come in." Caleb ducked his head slightly to enter the low doorway, his large frame making the small cabin seem even smaller. He glanced around with interest at what she'd done with the simple space, the wildflowers on the table, the colorful quilt she'd purchased from Mrs. Abernathy draped over the rocking chair, the books neatly arranged on the shelf. "You've made it homey," he observed, setting the basket on the table. "Suits you." "Thank you," Bethany replied, pleased by his approval. "It's not much, but it's comfortable." "Brought those tamales I promised," Caleb said, uncovering the basket to reveal several cloth-wrapped bundles. "And Mrs. Martinez sent some of her corn bread when she heard I was visiting the new school teacher." "How thoughtful." "I've made apple pie for dessert," Bethany said, gesturing to the pie cooling on the windowsill. "Though I'm not sure it will compare to Mrs. Martinez's cooking." "I'm sure it's delicious," Caleb assured her. "Been a long time since I had homemade pie." They settled into an easy rhythm, Bethany setting the table while Caleb described the tamale-making process he'd observed in the Martinez household. The meal was indeed delicious, the tamales spicier than anything Bethany had tasted in Boston, but wonderfully flavorful. As they ate, Caleb provided insights about the families whose children would be in Bethany's class, which parents valued education, which might be resistant to new teaching methods, which children had particular challenges or talents. "Brett Carson's boy, Timothy, is smart as a whip, but has a rebellious streak," Caleb explained. "His father expects him to take over the ranch someday, so he doesn't see much point in book learning beyond the basics. You'll have to convince him it's worth his while." "And the Abbott girls?" Bethany asked, making mental notes. "Sweet kids, but their mother died last winter. Their father does his best, but they've been a bit wild since then. Especially the older one, Margaret, 14 going on 20 if you take my meaning." The conversation continued through dinner and pie, gradually shifting from school matters to more personal topics. Bethany found herself sharing stories of her life in Boston, her family's disappointment when she'd chosen teaching over marriage to their preferred suitor, and even her correspondence with Edward Holloway. "His letters were so thoughtful, so intelligent," she explained, still bewildered by the contrast between the man she'd imagined and the one who'd abandoned her. "I truly believed I knew him." "Some men can write one way and live another," Caleb said, his expression darkening. "Though leaving a woman to die in the desert goes beyond deception into something much worse. I've wondered if I should report him to the authorities," Bethany admitted. "But I have no proof and I've started a new life here. Perhaps it's best to leave the past behind." Caleb studied her face. Is that what you want, to forget it all happened? Bethany considered the question carefully. Not forget, no. What happened in the desert led me here, to Carson's Creek, to this life. She met his eyes. To you. The words hung between them, more revealing than she'd intended. Caleb's expression softened, and he reached across the table to take her hand. I'm glad you're here, Bethany, he said simply. Even if the circumstances that brought you were terrible, the touch of his hand on hers sent warmth spreading through her body. So am I, she replied softly. The moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken feelings. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat and reluctantly withdrew his hand. I should probably be heading back. It'll be dark soon. Disappointment flickered through Bethany, but she nodded. Of course. Thank you for coming and for the tamales. They were wonderful. As they stood, Caleb glanced at the small bookshelf. What are you reading these days? He asked, moving to examine the titles. Bethany joined him by the shelf. Mostly school books, preparing for classes. But I did bring a few personal volumes. She pointed to a worn copy of Jane Eyre. This is a favorite. Caleb picked up the book, turning it over in his hands. My Sarah loved to read, used to read aloud to me in the evenings. A shadow of grief passed over his features. I miss that. Without thinking, Bethany placed her hand on his arm. I could read to you sometime, she offered softly. He looked down at her, surprise and something warmer kindling in his eyes. I'd like that, he said, his voice rough with emotion. They were standing very close now, the bookshelf at their backs, the small cabin suddenly feeling intimate rather than cramped. Bethany was acutely aware of his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to him. Bethany, he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. Yes, she prompted, her heart racing. I know it hasn't been long since we met, he continued carefully, and you're still settling into town, but I'd like to call on you properly if you're amenable. Joy bloomed in Bethany's chest. I'd like that very much, she said, unable to keep the smile from her face. Relief and happiness transformed Caleb's expression. Good. That's good. For a moment they simply stood there, smiling at each other like a pair of youngsters instead of grown adults. Then, with visible reluctance, Caleb placed Jane Eyre back on the shelf and reached for his hat. I'll come by next Saturday, if that suits you, he said as they moved toward the door. Maybe we could have a picnic by the creek if the weather's fine. That sounds wonderful, Bethany replied, following him onto the porch. In the fading light of early evening, Caleb turned to her, his expression now serious. I should warn you, I'm not much of a talker most days. The ranch keeps me busy, and I've grown used to my own company. I might not be what you're expecting in a suitor. Bethany's heart warmed at his honesty. Caleb, I've already seen who you are, a man who would carry a stranger to safety, who treats others with respect, who dances even when he's out of practice because a woman asked him to. She smiled up at him. I'm not expecting anything other than what you've already shown me. The tension in his shoulders eased. You have a way of making things seem simple, he said with a small smile. Some things are, she replied. Not easy, perhaps, but simple. This time, when Caleb reached for her hand, there was a deliberate intent in his movement. He drew her slightly closer, his eyes never leaving hers, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished. Instead, Bethany tilted her face up to his in silent invitation. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, a brief touch of his lips to hers that nonetheless sent a cascade of sensation through her body. When he pulled back, the wonder in his expression mirrored what Bethany felt. Good night, Bethany, he said softly, releasing her hand with apparent reluctance. Good night, Caleb, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Be safe riding home. She watched from the porch as he mounted his horse and rode away, lifting his hand in farewell before disappearing around the bend in the road. Only when he was completely out of sight did Bethany touch her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. The weeks that followed took on a pattern that brought a happiness Bethany hadn't known was possible. She threw herself into teaching with enthusiasm, quickly winning over most of her students with her combination of high expectations and genuine interest in their progress. The challenges Caleb had warned her about proved real but not insurmountable. Timothy Carson gradually showed more interest when Bethany connected mathematics to ranch management, and the Abbott girls responded well to the extra attention she provided after school. Every Saturday, Caleb would ride into town, sometimes staying only for the afternoon if ranch responsibilities called, other times remaining until Sunday morning if weather or circumstances permitted. Their courtship progressed with a sweetness that Bethany treasured: picnics by the creek, walks through town, quiet evenings in her cabin where she would read aloud while Caleb listened, occasionally interjecting with thoughtful comments. As autumn approached, bringing cooler weather and shorter days, their feelings for each other deepened. Caleb began to speak more freely about his past, his childhood in Missouri, his service in the Union cavalry during the war, the journey west afterward where he'd met Sarah, their brief marriage, and the fever that had taken her. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again," he confessed one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "After Sarah died, I figured that part of my life was over." Bethany leaned her head against his shoulder, their hands intertwined. "I understand. I never expected to find someone like you, especially not in such circumstances." "Found each other, I reckon," Caleb said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. The town observed their courtship with varying degrees of interest. Most people seemed pleased. Caleb was well respected, and Bethany had quickly become a valued member of the community. A few, like the widow Johnson, who had apparently set her sights on Caleb before Bethany's arrival, were less enthusiastic, but even she eventually thawed when Bethany helped her son overcome his reading difficulties. As October arrived, bringing the first frost and the harvest season, Caleb invited Bethany to visit his ranch. "I'd like you to see it," he said as they walked back from church one Sunday. "Meet the Martinez brothers and their family, see the horses." The invitation felt significant, a further step in their relationship, an inclusion in the part of his life that was most important to him. "I'd love to," Bethany replied. "Perhaps next Saturday. School's closed for the Harvest Festival." The following Saturday dawned clear and crisp, perfect for the hour-long ride to Stone Ranch. Caleb arrived in town early, leading a gentle mare for Bethany to ride. They set out as the sun was just clearing the eastern mountains, Bethany wearing her warmest shawl against the morning chill. The landscape changed as they rode north: more hills, more trees, and eventually, the creek that gave the town its name widening into a substantial stream that cut through Caleb's property. When they crested a final rise, Stone Ranch spread out before them, a modest but well-maintained collection of buildings nestled in a small valley, with corrals containing horses of various colors and several fenced pastures beyond. "It's beautiful," Bethany said sincerely, taking in the peaceful scene. "I can see why you love it here." Pride was evident in Caleb's voice as he pointed out features of the ranch. "Main house is there, built it myself with help from the Martinez brothers. Barns to the left, bunkhouse beyond that where Miguel and Julio stay. That's their family cabin over by the cottonwoods. Miguel's wife Elena and their 3 children live there." As they approached, a boy of about 12 spotted them and ran toward the family cabin, shouting excitedly in Spanish. By the time Caleb and Bethany reached the main yard, a welcoming committee had assembled: a stocky man with a wide smile, a slender woman with a baby on her hip, the boy who had spotted them, and two younger children who peered shyly from behind their mother's skirts. "Miguel, Elena," Caleb called in greeting as he dismounted and moved to help Bethany from her horse. "This is Miss Davis, the schoolteacher I told you about." "Welcome to Stone Ranch, Miss Davis," Miguel said, his English accented but clear. "Caleb has told us much about you." Elena stepped forward with a warm smile, shifting the baby to extend her free hand. "We are very happy to meet you. Please, you will stay for dinner. I have been cooking since morning." "I'd be honored," Bethany replied, charmed by their welcome. The day passed in a whirl of activity. Caleb showed Bethany every aspect of the ranch operation, the breeding program he'd developed, the training methods he used with the young horses, the improvements he'd made to the property over the years. His passion for his work was evident in every explanation, every demonstration, and Bethany found herself falling a little more in love with him as she witnessed this side of his character. The Martinez family was equally welcoming, the children quickly overcoming their shyness to show Bethany their favorite spots around the ranch. Elena insisted on teaching her to make tortillas, laughing good-naturedly at Bethany's clumsy first attempts. Even Julio, Miguel's quieter brother who had initially seemed reserved, warmed up during the abundant dinner, sharing amusing stories about Caleb's early days on the ranch. As evening approached, Caleb suggested a walk to show Bethany one last feature of the property before they needed to return to town. They followed a path that led up a gentle slope behind the main house, emerging onto a small plateau that offered a stunning view of the entire valley, now bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "This is where I decided to build," Caleb said, standing beside Bethany as they took in the vista. "Came across this spot after days of riding, looking for the right place. Knew immediately this was it." "It's perfect," Bethany said softly, understanding completely why he'd chosen this location. The beauty was undeniable, but there was also a sense of peace, of rightness that seemed to emanate from the land itself. Caleb turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Bethany, I brought you here because I wanted you to see it all, to understand what my life is." He took a deep breath. "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures. What you see is what there is: the ranch, the horses, a simple life that's sometimes hard but mostly good." Bethany's heart began to race as she recognized the importance of what he was saying. "It's a beautiful life, Caleb." "It could be our life," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you wanted it to be." Tears pricked at Bethany's eyes as joy welled up within her. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Caleb nodded, a smile beginning to curve his lips. "Not doing a very good job of it, am I?" He squeezed her hands gently. "Bethany Davis, I love you. I think I started falling in love with you that first night by the campfire, though I was too stubborn to admit it then. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Bethany said without hesitation, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Yes, Caleb, I'll marry you. I love you too." The kiss that followed was different from the careful, gentle ones they'd shared before, deeper, more passionate, filled with the promise of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, both breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have a ring yet," he said apologetically. "Wasn't sure if you'd say yes." Bethany laughed, feeling lighter than air. "As if I could have said anything else. But truly, I don't need a ring, Caleb, just you." They stood together on the plateau until the first stars appeared, making plans for their future. They would marry before winter set in. Bethany would finish the school term, and then she would move to the ranch. Caleb spoke of expansions he'd been considering to the main house, adding a proper kitchen, another bedroom, perhaps a small library where Bethany could keep her books. "What about your teaching?" he asked as they began the walk back to the ranch house, arms around each other. "Will you miss it?" Bethany considered the question seriously. "Perhaps, but there are children nearby who need education too. Maybe I could teach the Martinez children and others from surrounding ranches a few days a week. We could fix up the old storage building as a small schoolhouse," Caleb suggested, warming to the idea. "There are at least a dozen children within riding distance who get little formal education." By the time they returned to the main yard, where Miguel had already saddled their horses for the ride back to town, their future had taken shape in their minds, a shared vision of a life built on love, respect, and common purpose. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Carson's Creek, met with general approval and good wishes. Martha Thompson immediately began organizing the wedding, which would take place in the church the first weekend of November. Mrs. Abernathy and several other women offered to help Bethany create a suitable wedding dress, while Mayor Wilson insisted on hosting a celebration dinner afterward. The school board was disappointed to learn they would be losing their teacher at the end of the term, but understood when Bethany explained her plans to establish a small school for the ranch children. They even offered to donate some surplus books and supplies to help her get started. As the wedding day approached, Bethany found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. The terrible experience of being abandoned in the desert now seemed like a blessing in disguise, the catalyst that had led her to Caleb, and a happiness she hadn't known was possible. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with a light dusting of early snow on the distant mountains. Bethany dressed in the simple but elegant gown the town's women had helped her create, ivory satin with lace trim salvaged from her mother's wedding dress, which she'd brought west as a memento. Martha and several other women helped her prepare in the small room behind the church, arranging her hair with sprigs of dried lavender and tying blue ribbons into the braided crown as something borrowed and something blue. "You look beautiful, dear," Martha said, stepping back to admire the result. "Caleb won't know what hit him." A knock at the door heralded Mayor Wilson, who had offered to walk Bethany down the aisle in the absence of her father. "Ready, Miss Davis?" he asked with a warm smile. "The groom's looking mighty nervous out there." "Perfectly ready, Mayor," Bethany replied, gathering her small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers and evergreen sprigs. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion for Bethany. She would later remember snippets with perfect clarity, the look on Caleb's face when she appeared at the back of the church. His hands steady but eyes suspiciously bright as they exchanged vows. The solid weight of the simple gold band he placed on her finger, the cheer that went up from the assembled townspeople when Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife. The celebration that followed at the town hall was joyous and relaxed, with abundant food, music, and dancing. Caleb and Bethany moved through the crowd together, accepting congratulations and well wishes, sharing their first dance as husband and wife to the same tune they danced to at the social where their courtship had truly begun. "Happy, Mrs. Stone," Caleb murmured as they swayed together, his arms secure around her waist. "Completely," Bethany replied, looking up at the man who had become her world. "And you, Mr. Stone?" "More than I ever thought possible," he said, bending to kiss her lightly, heedless of the approving murmurs from those watching. Later that evening, they rode together to Stone Ranch under a sky brilliant with stars, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting in the desert months before. The main house had been prepared for their arrival, fires lit in the fireplaces, lamps glowing in the windows, a wreath of evergreens on the door to mark the beginning of their life together. Caleb lifted Bethany from her horse and carried her across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in what was now their home. "Welcome home, Bethany Stone," he said softly, cupping her face in his hands. "I like the sound of that," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. As winter settled over Stone Ranch, Bethany and Caleb settled into married life with a naturalness that surprised them both. The adjustment from independent lives to partnership had its challenges, but their deep respect for each other smoothed the way through minor disagreements and necessary compromises. Bethany finished the school term in Carson's Creek, riding to and from town with Caleb on the days he needed supplies or had business there, staying overnight at her old cabin when the weather made daily travel impractical. The school board had already hired her replacement, a young man from Denver with impressive credentials who seemed genuinely interested in building on the foundation Bethany had established. At the ranch, Bethany quickly found her place in the daily rhythm of operations. While Caleb worked with the horses and oversaw the general management, she took charge of the household, learned the bookkeeping from Miguel, who had been handling it previously, and began planning the small school that would open in the spring. The old storage building was cleaned out, insulated against the cold, and gradually transformed into a cozy one-room schoolhouse. Caleb built simple desks and benches, while Alina helped Bethany sew curtains for the windows and cushions for the seats. Word spread to neighboring ranches, and by the time Christmas approached, Bethany had commitments from families representing 15 children who would attend her school 3 days a week once the weather improved. Their first Christmas as husband and wife was simple, but meaningful. They rode into town for the church service, exchanged modest gifts with friends there, then returned to the ranch for a festive dinner with the Martinez family. In the privacy of their bedroom that night, they exchanged their personal gifts, a finely crafted leather-bound journal for Bethany, who had mentioned wanting to record their story, and for Caleb, a silver pocket watch Bethany had ordered from Denver, engraved with their wedding date and the words "for all time." As winter deepened, bringing heavy snow that sometimes isolated the ranch for days at a time, Bethany and Caleb discovered the special intimacy that came with being snowbound together. They established cherished routines, reading aloud by the fire in the evenings, Caleb teaching Bethany to play chess, Bethany introducing Caleb to the poetry she loved, both of them sharing stories of their past and dreams for their future. In late January, during a rare clear spell between storms, Bethany rode with Caleb to check on a pregnant mare in the farthest pasture. As they crested a rise that offered a view of the entire ranch spread out below them, Bethany reined in her horse, suddenly overwhelmed by the beauty of the snow-covered landscape and the journey that had brought her here. "What is it?" Caleb asked, bringing his horse alongside hers. "I was just thinking about that night in the desert," Bethany said, her breath clouding in the cold air. "How close I came to—" She couldn't finish the thought. Caleb reached across to take her gloved hand in his. "But you didn't. You survived, Bethany. You're stronger than you knew." "Because of you," she said, squeezing his hand. "You saved me." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "I was just existing before you came along. Now I'm living again." As spring gradually reclaimed the land, bringing new growth and the birth of foals in the breeding program, Bethany's small school opened its doors. Children from 4 neighboring ranches joined the Martinez children 3 days a week, arriving on horseback or in wagons, eager for the education their parents had often lacked. Bethany discovered that teaching in this setting brought different challenges and rewards than her experience in Boston or even Carson's Creek. The ages and abilities of her students varied widely, requiring creative approaches to ensure each child was appropriately engaged and challenged. But the genuine appreciation from both children and parents made every effort worthwhile. On days when school was not in session, Bethany often accompanied Caleb as he worked with the horses, gradually learning to assist with the gentler aspects of training. She developed a particular bond with a spirited filly born that spring, spending hours gaining the young horse's trust until she was the only person besides Caleb the filly would approach willingly. "She's yours if you want her," Caleb said one evening as they watched the filly prancing around her mother in the nearest pasture. "Once she's old enough to start training properly." Bethany's face lit up. "Really? I've never had my own horse before." "Every rancher's wife should have her own mount," Caleb replied with a smile. "And that one seems to have chosen you already." Life settled into a pattern of purposeful work and quiet contentment, marked by seasonal changes and small milestones. They traveled to town regularly for supplies and social occasions, maintaining close friendships with the Thompsons and others who had welcomed Bethany so warmly upon her arrival. Caleb's horse breeding program flourished, gaining a reputation that brought buyers from as far away as California. In the fall, just before their first wedding anniversary, Bethany confirmed what she had begun to suspect: they were expecting a child in the spring. Caleb's reaction to the news was everything she could have hoped for: joy mixed with protective concern. Immediate plans for expanding the house to include a proper nursery, and a tenderness that manifested in countless small ways as the pregnancy progressed. The winter passed more comfortably than the previous one, the house now boasting additional insulation, a larger kitchen with a reliable cook stove, and the promised library where Bethany continued to teach through the cold months, albeit with a reduced schedule as her pregnancy advanced. On a mild day in early April, with the ranch bursting with new life and spring flowers dotting the hillsides, Bethany gave birth to a daughter after a long but uncomplicated labor attended by Alina and a midwife from Carson's Creek. They named her Sarah, Elizabeth Stone Sarah, after Caleb's first wife, in a gesture that Bethany had suggested, feeling that acknowledging the woman who had been so important to Caleb was a way of honoring the full journey of his life, and Elizabeth after Bethany's mother. As Caleb held his daughter for the first time, the wonder and love in his expression brought tears to Bethany's eyes. "She's perfect," he whispered, carefully returning the swaddled infant to Bethany's arms, "just like her mother." "I was thinking she has your eyes," Bethany replied with a tired smile, "and hopefully your steady nature rather than my stubbornness." "A bit of both would serve her well," Caleb said, settling on the edge of the bed and wrapping his arm around Bethany's shoulders. "Thank you," he added softly. "For her, for everything." In the years that followed, Stone Ranch prospered and grew. The small school Bethany had established became known throughout the region for its excellence, eventually requiring the construction of a larger building and the hiring of a second teacher to accommodate the increasing number of students. Bethany continued to teach the older children, focusing on literature, history, and sciences, while maintaining the overall administration of the school. Caleb's breeding program expanded beyond cow ponies to include carriage horses for wealthy buyers in Denver and Santa Fe. The Martinez brothers became full partners in the business, their expertise and loyalty rewarded with a share in the growing success. The original 200 acres grew to 500, then 1,000, allowing for larger herds and more diverse operations. Sarah grew into a bright, curious child with her father's quiet confidence and her mother's love of books. When she was 3, she was joined by a brother, William Caleb Stone, a sturdy boy with a natural affinity for horses that manifested almost from the moment he could walk. Through all the changes and growth, through challenges and triumphs, the foundation of Bethany and Caleb's relationship remained as solid as the day they had exchanged vows. Their love had deepened with shared experiences, mutual respect, and the family they had created together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Caleb surprised Bethany with a trip back to the spot where he had found her in the desert so many years before. They made camp there, much as Caleb had on that fateful night, though with considerably more comfort provided by a larger tent, proper bedding, and cooking equipment. As they sat beside the campfire under the vast desert sky, Caleb took Bethany's hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding band that had never left her finger. 10 years, he said reflectively. Sometimes it seems like yesterday that I found you here, half frozen and stubborn as the day is long. Bethany laughed, leaning against his shoulder. And sometimes it feels like I've always been with you, like my life didn't truly begin until that moment. Do you ever regret it? Caleb asked, his voice serious. Coming west, I mean, despite everything that happened with Holloway. Bethany considered the question thoughtfully. How could I regret the path that led me to you, to our children, our home, the life we've built? She turned to face him fully in the firelight. If I had to walk through that desert again, knowing what awaited me on the other side, I would do so without hesitation. Caleb's eyes, still as piercingly blue as the day they'd met despite the lines that now crinkled at their corners when he smiled, held hers with unwavering intensity. I love you, Bethany Stone, more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. And I love you, Caleb Stone, she replied, her heart as full as it had been on their wedding day, for all time. As they sealed the promise with a kiss, the desert stars bearing witness just as they had a decade before, Bethany reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. What had seemed like the worst moment of her life, being abandoned in the harsh wilderness, had in fact been the beginning of her greatest happiness. The cowboy who had carried her to his fire had ultimately carried her into a life more fulfilling than she could have imagined, proving that sometimes the most difficult paths led to the most beautiful destinations. In the years to come, their story would be told and retold by their children, by their grandchildren, by neighbors and friends who had witnessed the love that had grown from that chance rescue in the desert. It became something of a legend in Carson's Creek, a reminder that even in the wild, unforgiving territory of the West, love could take root and flourish, transforming lives and building legacies that would endure long after the original pioneers had returned to the earth that had shaped them. And through it all, through every season and challenge, every joy and sorrow, Bethany and Caleb remained each other's compass and shelter, the teacher who had found her true home in the wilderness, and the cowboy who had opened his heart again when he carried a half-frozen stranger to his fire and ultimately into his arms.